turns out Mora makes the best survival knife that you've never heard of. Folks, this is Fernando doing another video for the Mora survivalists. And before I forget, remember that if you want to learn more about survival preparedness the way I do it here on the channel, street survival skills for the practical aspect of a lot of this stuff, use of weapons, EDC, and so on, and surviving the economic collapse. Very important given everything going on these days. Now, in my previous video, I showed this knife, which is a Mora, but it's a bit of a longer Mora. Typically, when someone talks about, oh yeah, I'm getting into bushcrafting, survival, and so on, okay, yeah, get yourself a Mora knife, a basic Mora knife. This is actually called Basic 511, okay? And this is your basic cheap Mora. 10 bucks, give or take, maybe a little bit more, maybe a little bit less, but it's a fantastic option. It's made in Sweden, it's very high quality, super affordable, it is pretty tough, and it will cut all day long. It is a Scandi grind, fantastic for basically cutting tasks. Anything you need to cut, and I like these ones instead of the companion. This gives a little bit more hand protection. I find that a little bit better, and there's nothing wrong with the companion, but this, I feel it's a little bit safer, and I like it a little bit more. But when it comes down to cutting, this kind of edge with a good carbon steel will go on all day long and will be fantastic for the bushcrafting and survival in nature kind of thing. Now, as you probably know, you also want a knife that is tough. You want a knife that can take a beating. This one can take a lot of beatings with a little bit of minimal common sense if you're not trying to specifically break the knife. But if you're going to be giving it a heck of a beating, you may want to go with the heavy duty model. This is the more pro robust, all right, and it's basically a little bit of a thicker blade, a little bit of a thicker stock, and it will take a nice beating, but it's still a short blade, which is fine for cutting. It's fine. It's piercing, okay, but in terms of survival is where it becomes a lot more difficult, because here's where we want the perfect knife. The knife that does everything. The knife that not only cuts, but pries, hammers, digs, chops, batons, and you can do all of that right with your survival knife. And some people will say it's impossible to have the perfect knife. I will just say it's very, very difficult to find one knife that does pretty much a lot of this or all of this kind of well or very well. But if we go back to the military history of knives, one of the more emblematic knives has been the famous K-bar knife. This is one of the more modern Ontarios. I have one of the old original K-bars over there, but this is what you would assume is a typical K-bar style of knife. Why was this so successful when it wasn't even inspired by traditional military knives? This was in fact basically copying what was already being used by soldiers, which were buying hunting knives from the commercial market. Well, because it's long enough to do what a military combat knife is supposed to do, but it's also a little bit broader. It's a little bit of a heavier, bigger knife. And when it came down to it, not only was it used for fighting in trenches, a lot more was done in terms of the utilitarian aspect. And here's where we start talking about survival and utilitarian uses. This was good enough for chopping. Yes, of course, we all know about the rat tang not being super strong, but when it came to chopping, prying, with a little bit of common sense and understanding of the tools you have, you could do a heck of a lot of utilitarian and survival things with your K-bar knife. That's how, as time went by, we ended up understanding that for a survival knife these days we look at something kind of like this. It is big, it is strong, it will cut, but it is a bit of a larger knife. Larger knives do more stuff than smaller knives, and you may like tiny knives and all, but ideally, if you could have it when you need it, usually bigger is better. And here we have a great knife. This is the SE Junglas. Now they make a shorter version that says a lot about how little people were actually carrying these things. But if you have to chop, cut, and it's called a machete, even though it's not really a machete. This is just a large knife. Historically, large knives have been the way to go for the guy living out in the bush, in the frontiers. If you needed a tool, guys in the Amazons, they will have their machetes. Usually will have larger machetes, but usually a smaller machete also comes into play. But this is heavy, this is big, and you will rarely see people carrying a lot of this in their in their belts. That's why these days I assume that the perception of what a survival knife should be, it's kind of like what I ended up doing with my own survival knife, the Aitor Furfel, which is my design, made by Aitor in Spain. This is a fantastic survival knife. Yes, of course, I will say so as expected, because I designed it and I got to do what I would want to do in a survival knife, but it's nothing new. The idea of a medium-size full tang knife being what you want to have in terms of a do-all survival knife, it's nothing that I've invented myself. Yeah, a little bit of that recurve blade, I think it's giving it a little bit more chopping capability, while at the same time having a very tough blade. There's a lot of metal, and it's good quality metal. This is N680, and unlike the 1095, which is traditionally used mostly because it's cheaper and needs this crappy awful coating, when you have high quality stainless steel, not only will it hold the edge longer than your 1095, it will also resist. And this one in particular, N680, is particularly rust resistant. It will be almost impossible for you to find one of these rusted no matter what. But great edge retention, very tough, specifically because it was requested to have not so high of a rock wool hardness so as to have maximum edge retention, instead preferring to have extra toughness because of the kind of abuse you will put a survival knife through. In spite of that, holds the edge longer than your traditional 1095 in most survival knives. But these come at a price. I think these go for like $180. Not sure how much Aitor is selling them right now, but usually this kind of knife is going to be on an upper $250. If you look at the Falk-Nivens on the same range, it's going to be a $250 knife. This one I think is a great deal, not just because I was involved in it myself. But here's where you come to this point of, okay, if I have to pry open a door, if I have to beat the crap, if I have to cut a hole through a wall, I would rather have this knife rather than something that is lighter. Definitely not this one. But here's where Glock comes in with their very traditional military knife. Glock says that this is a survival knife. This is the idea of a survival knife according to Glock. The reality, though, is that the Austrian military was looking for a bayonet, and Mr. Glock, even before he started making pistols, Glock was making this knife. This is the 1978 model. I think it's one of the nicer ones. They also have the serrated version. I prefer the one without the serrations. And as you see, this is not used because I have several of these, and actually the one I use rather often is this one. So I have used it a lot, and I can tell, yes, it does what it's supposed to do. It is a tough blade. Now, it's not the best cutting knife. If you want a better cutting knife, you can go with something like this. But when it comes down to survival, will it cut? Yes, it will. Will it cut it as well as a Mora? Of course not. It hasn't got the Scandi grind, hasn't got the steel and that same heat treatment, but it will cut. It will definitely cut. And besides that, it is tough. It is lightweight. It is cheap. $30, $35 give or take. You can pry quite a bit with this. You can hammer, beat on it, and you know what? In terms of survival tasks, even though it will not cut as nicely as your Mora, you have a longer blade. This means you can baton through larger logs, and actually that's what I use this one for the most. For the fireplace, when I need something to baton a log, I use this one, beat on it, job done. Yeah, edge retention with a 1095 at 55 Rockwell hardness, it's not great, but I think that toughness is more important for a survival knife than edge retention. If you want to have both, you will have to pay for that, as I just explained. But for $30, this is very hard to beat. Now, this isn't something super original. For a long time, we've known that for military blades, you want to have a 7-inch blade, 7.5, 7 to 8 inch blade long knife. And here is where we go back to talking about survival. This is a survival utilitarian kind of knife. Will it be able to baton? Will it be able to pry some? Yes, but mostly it's intended as what it is, which is it's a bayonet. It's a bayonet knife. So the idea is to stick this into a rifle and use it in combat. But what they did is take what was known historically to be a fighting knife. Basically, this is just a modern dagger, and people have been carrying daggers for a very long time. Actually, the Argentine gaucho is known for carrying a facón, which is basically a dagger. Yes, they use this in the field for a lot of things, utilitarian tests and so on, but the DNA of this blade, of the facón, this is a traditional facón, it is just a dagger with a fancy grip, Argentine style. But in essence, the blade geometry says dagger all day long, and it's ideal for one thing and one thing only, which is stabbing people. It does that great. This is what this knife is mostly about. So it becomes a little bit more utilitarian, but ideally stabbing. And I think that if I'm looking at a modern day survival knife, I want to have that, knife that will chop, beat, hammer, dig, and punch through walls. And you will have, there's no free lunch here. If you want to have that weight, it will be a heavier knife. If you want to have the lighter blade, yes, but it will not smash through stuff, and you don't have the same amount of steel to take the beating, right, from the larger, heavier knife. Of course, heat treatment steel will make a difference in terms of how much abuse it can take or not, but if it's well designed, more steel should be better for that kind of thing. But when it comes down to prying, fighting, this is probably one of the best bets for the money. That's what I have called this knife at times the best survival knife you can buy for the money, and I stick to that. I think this is a fantastic knife, again, especially for the money, especially for how lightweight it is. These are made in Austria. This is great quality. Made in Austria, made in Sweden, made in Finland. This is the fancier version of your Glock knife without the bayonet implications. This is the JP Peltonen, made in Finland by Fiskars. Fantastic knife, but as you see, it's really not all that different. It is just a larger, narrow blade. But of course, Mr. Peltonen wanted something that was more of a cutting tool for those utilitarian, survival, bushcrafty kind of tasks. Something that would carve nicely, something that would do what this knife does well in terms of a fighting knife, meaning a kind of like a dagger, long, narrow blade, but also cut well. It is better steel. It is hardened differently. It will not take the same kind of abuse that the Glock knife will, but it will cut more, it will cut better, it will have a much better edge retention. This is more of a cutting tool, somewhat for fighting. This is more of a fighting bayonet thing that kind of cuts okay, all right? And that may be all you need. Honestly, that may be all you need. But reaching the final conclusion of this video is, this is, as I see it right now, maybe the best knife for the money for a survivalist. If I had 20 bucks for a survival knife, this is what I would buy, instead of maybe spending the 30 or 35 bucks for a Glock knife, because this one will do things better than that one at a cheaper price. And I'm talking about the same idea that Mr. Peltonen had, which is great. I absolutely agree with his idea of, I want to have just a longer Mora. I want to have the Scandi grind longer, and yes, because of, and this was a great call, this Teflon kind of coating, but this is more expensive. This is like an 80, 90 buck knife. This is quite a bit more expensive. It is tough, even though it's not as tough as these two, but it will cut. So longer Mora. So Mora, there is already a longer Mora, which is this one. So for 20 bucks, you have a knife that will cut as your traditional Mora, which is what it is. Not only that, you have a longer blade, meaning it will baton through longer logs than your tiny little Mora. It's not going to be chopping. It's not going to be chopping much at all, even though you can a little bit better because you have a little bit more blade reach. It's going to be a little bit less tough than the shorter blade, mostly because of a matter of geometry of distribution of steel and the forces implied in beating this against something that is like a rock or something very hard. But you have that longer reach. You have a knife that will do what this one does in terms of being a fighting knife. Man, this is long enough to do all the damage that your Glock bayonet knife will. And not only that, it is a lot sharper. So when it comes to slashing, forget about it. This thing will cut through meat like butter. And it's even lighter than the Mora, than the Glock, and it has a more comfortable grip. So if you're going to be cutting a lot, you want to have this one over that one. If you're going to be fighting with someone, I would take this one over the Glock because of how sharp it is and being just the same in terms of stabby ability. And the grip, the grip is fantastic. Anyway, this is probably the best one, and it's unfortunate that it's not more popular, or I don't think it's even being produced right now. But there it is, knife number 731 all round, made by Mora. I think it's the the affordable version of the Glock knife that does many things even better than the Glock knife does itself. Guys, it's going to be all for now. I'll leave some of the links below, especially for the books and whatever it is that you find. See you on the next video. Have an awesome day. Take care.